And our goal now is to take our static dust particles and then turn them into an animated particle setup. And our very first step is to set up our time slider. So by default, we don't actually have the time slider, so I'll just right click in between my 3D view and my Geometry Nodes network, right click, horizontal split, split that down and go ahead and grab the time slider so we can begin working with that. Great, and now we're ready to start animating. And that brings us to step number 2, which is to get to know scene time. So generally speaking, anytime we need to get data that's happening from outside of our Geometry Nodes network, say from our 3D view or our time slider, and we want to bring this into our Geometry Nodes network, what we have to do is use an input node. So an input node, just bringing in something from outside of the node network. And specifically, we want to get to know the scene time input node. So click and drag to drop on that in. Now, how do we actually animate this noise pattern? How do we actually make it move? Well, we don't actually want to adjust the scale because we like the frequency of that, so I'm going to leave that at a value of 5. And what we're going to do is change this from a 3D noise texture to a 4D noise texture. And what this does is it gives us access to the W parameter. So W is time within this noise texture. So now if I animate this W pattern, we'll see that, okay, now all of a sudden the dust particles start to animate around. We can see them starting to move, and the frequency and the scale and the distance of them is not changing. Great, so what we'll do here is now plug in seconds into W. And if I hit play, we'll start to see, okay, now we have a very chaotic animation. So let's take a moment and break down what is actually happening here and why this is getting so chaotic. And that brings us to step number 3, which is to slow it down. So we have 2 different parameters on our scene time here. We have seconds and then we have frame. So frame is very straightforward. It just takes frame, whatever frame we're currently on, and gives that number to this parameter. So currently the value is 72. Now, seconds is just that. So currently we are at 72 divided by 24 frames per second, and we get 3 seconds. So currently this value is reading 3. If I were to do something like disconnect W, make this value 3, right, and plug that in, we'll see that we have no difference now, right? It's just giving us a value of 3 because we're currently on 3 seconds. Now, the reason why this is going so fast is because these values are just strictly too high, right? So what we need to do is scale them down. So go to my add menu, I'm going to go utilities again. I'm going to grab a math node. So this time we're not working with vector math, we're working with just math because vectors have 3 values, whereas in this particular case, math, we're just going to be working with 1 value. Now, by default, it's going to be add, and that's not going to be what we want, right? So if we hit play again, it's still really chaotic what's happening here. You know, if I make this a negative value, it still sort of just does the same thing. That's because the add parameter, all it does is offset this. So this time slider is giving us values that are relative to itself. So we have 0, 1 second, 2 second, 3 second, 4 second, and it goes all the way down. If we're just adding a value, all this does is shift those values around, but it doesn't change the relative value to these. So a much better operation for us to use is going to be multiply. And if I just set this to something like 0.01 and then hit play, we'll see that we have a much slower animation, right? So what that is meaning for us here is that as this plays, say we have 0, instead of having the value go up to 1 second, it's now going to 0.1 seconds, and then 0.2 seconds, and then 0.3 seconds. Or in this particular case, 0.01, 0.02, 0.03, because we're multiplying those values by the 0.01. And there we go. Now our animation is done, and then we'll have the full node cheat sheet and the cheat sheets below.